Someone who paints a painting of the sunset. Part of the aesthetic experience of looking at that image is trying to understand what the person who made that image was feeling and wanted you to feel. We can get that from AI so long as we don't realize that AI has nothing to say, but as soon as we realize it has nothing to say, it just all turns into something that's very washed.
I'm Jasmine.
And I'm Maggie.
And you're listening to Culture Club Chats. This is our interview episode where we sit down with a guest to chat about life, culture, and creativity.
Today, Jazz and I are recording on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We would like to pay our respects to elders past and present and extend this to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander listeners today.
Cory Doctorow is a Canadian-British author, activist, journalist, and blogger. His work in the tech culture space hit new heights after the publication of his 2025 book, Enshittification: Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. Cory has written dozens of books spanning science fiction, non-fiction policy, young adult, graphic novels, and short stories.
Cory will be at the Sydney's Festival of Dangerous Ideas from the 22nd to the 23rd of August and Melbourne's Now or Never Festival presented by the Wheeler Centre on the 25th of August. His work in the privacy, media, copyright, AI, surveillance and tech space is vital. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. So as some background, we actually started this podcast a good 6 years ago. We were strictly a pop culture and celebrity podcast, right? But now we find that we're speaking about big tech and AI almost every week. Have you seen these worlds merging more and more?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, if you're talking about celebrities, it's hard to be a celebrity without the internet in the same way that it's hard to do anything without the internet. I often say this to colleagues of mine because I came up through, progressive politics that say, well, why should we even try and fix the internet? And, you know, as someone who spent his teenage years cycling around the streets of Toronto in the middle of the night in sub-zero weather, wheat pasting posters to the sides of telephone poles to get people out for demonstrations. If you think you're going to run a mass movement without the internet, I want you to spend a couple of sub-zero nights out with a bucket of wheat paste. And in the same way, if you think people are going to care about anything you do and you're not using the internet, I'd like to see your plan for it, because it's hard to imagine how it is that you are going to become someone of public regard and importance unless your conduct in some way intersects with the internet.
We also cover books on our podcast quite frequently. As a sci-fi writer, your job is to invent these futuristic stories based on the current world that we live in. We know that you can't predict the future, but as a Gen X, we're wondering if you could ever imagine the future looking the way that it looks now in the mid-2020s.
Yeah, you know, I think that a science fiction writer's job is far less to imagine a new gadget than to think about who the gadget does things for and who the gadget does things to. I think of science fiction as maybe the antidote to Margaret Thatcher's maxim that there is no alternative. You know, our riposte to that is there are 6 alternatives we can think of every day before breakfast. And there's nothing inevitable about the idea that if you have friends, Mark Zuckerberg needs to be privy to all of your conversations with them. And so I certainly, you know, if you go back to the 80s, 90s, and aughts, you see 2 currents in the way that people imagined technology in literature and film and in art. And they are a mix of incredible hopes for how things could be, the possibilities that technology might extend to us, and at the same time, absolute stark terror about what technology might do to us in terms of control and surveillance. And especially, you know, when you look back at the cyberpunks of the 1980s, one of the main characteristics of those writers is that they're writing about a world in which a small number of firms have metastasized and formed cartels and taken over the world and become multinationals. Now, for the most part, they imagine those companies are going to be Japanese, which, you know, in retrospect seems quite quaint. But at the same time, you know, there is an absolute imagining in the dawn of the Reagan years, at the heyday of the Thatcher era, when Margaret Thatcher and Augusto Pinochet in Chile and Brian Mulroney in Canada and Helmut Kohl in Germany and so on, when they're all sort of taking over the world with neoliberal politics, that the end state of that really is like a digital world, which, as Tom Eastman from New Zealand says, we have 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And that I think was absolutely not just foreseeable but foreseen. And while most science fiction writers are not very up on economics, in my experience, that they really do, I think, get the vibe right when you look back on that era. And I think a lot of science fiction writers from that era are today at great pains to remind us that cyberpunk was a warning and not a suggestion.
Yeah, watching The Terminator or any 80s movies nowadays, it's like, this is actually a bit too real now. It's not so fun to watch.
What draws you to, I think, looking at these themes of surveillance tech, etc., through the lens of fiction when you dabble in it so, constantly in the in the nonfiction world?
Yeah, so I've been a fiction writer for most of my life. I started selling stories as a teenager, and about when I was in my early 30s, I went to work for a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I've worked now for 25 years. So most of my adult life. I'm turning 55 in a few days. And EFF's mission is to, uphold digital rights in the on the virtual world and in virtual policy. And so, I've done treaty work for them and standards and lobbying and just activist rabble rousing and street demonstrations and everything in between for the last quarter century. And it was a very natural extension of the science fiction I was writing to the reason the themes of the science fiction mattered to me was the reason I became an activist. And so, I was always going to end up doing both. And there's lots of times where you can take this very abstract technical debate that people are mostly not engaging with, because for very good reasons, people mostly want to engage with things that are concrete and immediate, because those are the things that are, matters of life and death, as opposed to these things that won't be matters of life and death for a couple of decades. And by turning those into stories, you can elevate the salience of them and maybe avert them becoming a matter of life and death. It would have been very nice if we had felt as vividly about the climate emergency now, if we felt that way in the 1980s. And so we didn't have to wait for wildfires to be on our doorsteps before we decided it was time to start doing something about it.
And a lot of our audience will know you for the terms that you coin. One of your most famous is, of course, Enshittification. For people who aren't familiar with this term, can you please explain it for them?
Sure. Well, like I said, I've spent most of my adult life trying to get people to care about these issues, and I've come up with any number of, narratives and framing devices and similes and parables. But it turned out that dirty little word and the accompanying minor license to vulgarity at moments when you're frustrated with the networks that you rely on, but which are getting progressively worse and which you can't seem to escape, that was the key. And so I coined this term in an essay I wrote, and it has since taken on a bit of a life of its own. It's in the Macquarie Dictionary. It's just been inducted into the OED. It's in Webster's. It's been several different kinds of words of the year, and it's been an international bestseller, the book of the same title. And Enshittification is a theory about why platforms are going bad, and a description about the normal pathology of platform decay, the way that platforms typically go bad. And in that pathology, we see a 3-stage process of decay. In stage 1, platforms are good to their end users, but they find a way to lock them in. And in stage 2, once they know the users can't readily escape, they make things worse for those users in order to extend benefits to businesses. And then once the businesses are piled in and locked in, they make things worse for them as well. This is an area of departure from I think commonplaces that are not really true, like if you're not paying for the product, you're the product, which seems to imply that if you just gave them money, they treat you better, which is not true. They will treat you as badly as they can get away with. And so we see in stage two, the advertisers, publishers, other business customers that supply the income to these platforms, they get locked in. And so in stage three, they get extracted from as well. And, whether that's Amazon charging 60% junk fees to all of its platform sellers, or Uber lowering the wages of drivers monotonically, or advertisers on Facebook seeing their prices going through the roof even as the quality of ad targeting goes down and the amount of ad fraud explodes, that the business customers also have all the value drained off from them. And so in stage three, you have this end state where the value left in the platform is a kind of mingy homeopathic residue that's calculated to be just enough to keep users locked to the platform and then keep businesses locked to the users, and all the value is harvested for the executives and the shareholders.
Incredible, just what everybody wants, right? Can
Yeah.
you use this and paint a picture of what the decline of Google searching looks like today?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've all encountered this, right? You type a search query into Google that just a few years ago would have given you a nice crisp answer to whatever you were trying to find out. And instead what you have is like a paragraph of AI slop, and then you have 5 ads, and then you have 5 scam pages that have escaped and that are themselves just garbage ads. And when you click on them, you scroll through and you get 100 interrupters and a thing that demands that you subscribe to some email and some auto-playing video, and then a chum box with someone's weird tooth implants. And then if you're lucky, maybe you find out, how many ounces there are in a cup. Which is the thing you were trying to find out from the beginning. And, this is not an accident. Google, when they, over the last 25 years, is a company that has grown to acquire a 90% search market share. But the way they got that market share wasn't by being better than everyone else. The way they got that was by buying all of their competitors. So Google wants you to think they're, Willy Wonka's idea factory, and that, they're just coming up with product after product. And when you actually look at the history of the firm, almost everything they've done internally has been a failure, and all of their successes, so their video stack, their ad tech stack, server management, documents, collaboration, maps, directions, mobile, everything that they do except that search engine they launched a millennium ago is something they bought from someone else. They're just rich Uncle Pennybags, and they're buying other people's toys, right? And, that is unlawful. The competition laws of the world broadly prohibit that kind of anti-competitive merger, but we've had a 45-year period of tolerance for monopolistic conduct, and so we let them buy their way to dominance. And along the way, they bought all the shelf space. So no matter what carrier you use, no matter what hardware vendor you use, what operating system you use, no matter whether you're an Android or iOS, no matter what browser you're using, every search box you find is wired directly into Google's servers. And they're bribing Apple more than $20 billion a year not to enter the search market. And so this is how they end up with this 90% search market share. Now, here's the great paradox of a monopoly, is that when you hit 90%, you stop growing. And you stop growing because, there's no one else to search. You could raise 1 billion humans to maturity in the hopes that they become your customers. And Google has a product called Google Classroom. But the problem is that that's going to take 15 years to show results, and Wall Street wants results today. So Google lost 3 antitrust cases in 2024 and 2025 in the United States. Antitrust is what the Americans call competition law. And in one of those cases, what's called the search case, the U.S. Department of Justice released a bunch of internal emails that they compelled Google to disgorge. And in those memos, we see an incredible struggle that took place in 2019 and 2020 as Google's search market share was truly at its peak, as high as it could go. And a great tech critic named Ed Zitron reported these out. And what they show is that around this time, as the Google search revenue growth tapered off, the guy who was in charge of Google search revenue, an ex-McKinsey guy called Prabhakar Raghavan, had this idea that if you made search worse, you could increase search revenue because you'd have to search 2 or 3 times to get the answer that you used to be able to get once in one shot. And there's lots of easy ways Google has to make search worse, right? They can turn off the spell checking, or what's called query stemming, where like you search for trousers and they run a parallel search for pants and then they merge the results, or they do context awareness. So if there's a big scandal going on somewhere in the world, if someone's just thrown a sandwich at someone else and you search for the right kind of sandwich, then they show you those results at the top. You just turn that off, and now you're going to have to search 2 or 3 times to get your answer. And the person who is most horrified by this is another Google executive, a guy called Ben Gomes, who's on the technical side of search, and he's like an OG Google tech guy. He built out their server infrastructure from a few computers under a desk to a global system of data centers. And he's just palpably horrified. He hasn't missed his mother's funeral and his kids' Little League games to, Enshittify this search engine that he is so proud of and that he and everyone he knows uses all day long. And he loses the argument. And he loses the argument because why wouldn't you do this, right? It's not like people are going to find a search engine somewhere else. It doesn't matter where you're searching. It's always going to be a Google search box. He's just completely routed in this. And the thing is, Prabhakar Raghavan is definitely not the first person who's ever worked for Google who said, if you had to search more than once, we'd get more money because we'd show you ads more than once. But he's the first person who's won that argument. And the reason he's won that argument is that the policymakers, who, unlike Google executives, actually work for us, our competition regulators, our parliamentarians, our enforcers, they created an enshittigenic policy environment where the worst ideas of the worst people made the most money. And once you do that, then you get this outcome. The reason Google enshittifies is the same reason your dog licks its balls, because no one stops them and because they can.
And I think that's, why we keep going back to them. Like, we are all complaining about, how crap Google is, but it's still the first search engine you open up. I'm literally using Google Chrome right now. We are really tied to these platforms, and especially Instagram and TikTok for us as well. Your latest book is called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. Can you please tell us what a reverse centaur is?
Sure. Well, this isn't the first time we've had a big conflict between labor and automation. And so there's a pretty good literature about how labor and automation play out. And one of its truisms is that when workers drive automation, they typically do so in order to improve quality. Like, you might adopt a tool like Riverside, the one we're using now, because if you use Zoom, then you're at the mercy of network latency and you're not getting recordings at both ends, and so you end up with all kinds of substandard audio at the other side. But when bosses drive automation, they do so because they want to improve throughput, right? If you were working for someone else and they said, hey, we're using Riverside, it wouldn't just be about improving audio quality. It'd be like, now you're not going to be doing all those retakes and all that editing. We'd like you to do twice as many podcasts, right? And so this is not because bosses are necessarily just mustache-twirling villains. It's because when your relationship to a tool is that it's an asset that's depreciating or an expense item on your budget, you want to maximize the return from it, right? And so you want to use it as much as possible before it wears out, or while you're paying for that subscription every month. And this is where centaurs and reverse centaurs come in. In automation theory, a centaur is someone who is assisted by a machine. In Greek mythology, you have the human head on the horse's body. The horse is tireless, it's dexterous, it's fast, and it's strong, but it's not in possession of judgment. The judgment is coming from the human head that's directing its operations. And so when you are married to a machine, you're the head on top of the machine's body, and it might be stronger than you and be able to work longer than you and be able to lift things that you can't lift, but you're the one telling it where to go and what to do. A human on a bicycle is a centaur. You even look like a centaur when you're riding a bicycle. But also a human, using a spell checker is a centaur. And so that centaurship is quite nice, and it really corresponds to labor-driven automation adoption. A reverse centaur is the reverse, right? It's the horse's head on the human body. It's the machine directing the operations of the human. And of course, the machine is faster than you and can work longer than you and can lift things that are heavier than you can lift. And so it wants you to work at the absolute limit of your capability, because it has capabilities that exceed yours. You're the weakest link in the chain. You're the bottleneck in the system. And so the machine is pushing you and pushing you and pushing you. And so, Amazon warehouses are the most automated warehouses the world has ever seen. And Amazon warehouses have the highest rate of injury of any warehouse in America. And that's not a coincidence, it's a consequence. You're not going to spend 8 figures on warehouse automation only to leave the plant sitting idle. You're going to work the people who are the peripherals for the warehouse machines at the limit of their capabilities. And when you work at your limit, you eventually make a mistake. And when you make a mistake in a warehouse, you sometimes end up impaled on a forklift.
Yeah, wow. And I think adding to that whole issue is how extra surveilled these delivery drivers are. Can't take pee breaks, can't listen to music while they're driving to meet their KPIs. It's very dystopian stuff. Mm-hmm. We also want to talk more broadly about AI. A lot of our audience, including ourselves, are quite anti-AI, but we're at this weird standpoint where I feel very conflicted. Do we risk being left behind, especially as women in this space? Is there a line to draw?
So I think being anti-AI per se is weird. I think that opposing statistical inference is kind of a dead end, right? But if you're in charge of how you use AI, you might, for example, use Whisper to produce transcripts of your podcast so that when you're doing edits, you can pull up a clip, if you want to find the clip later and insert it in. That's fine, right? It's like that's just a plugin for your audio editing software. My first word processor, I'm old enough that, I had an Apple II Plus when I was like 9 years old in 1980. And my first word processor I got by going to the newsagent and buying a magazine with a word processor program printed in it and typing it into my computer.
What?
And that's how we used to get software. And in the years since, I have had many new plugins added to my word processor, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, and some of them other people use in ways that I think is stupid and makes their writing worse. But I've never had a word processor plugin to which my response was, hey, this is so good, let's bet the world economy on it. And while we're at it, we should put all the writers in a wood chipper, right? And so, if you think of AI as just a normal technology, as a tool, and if it's being driven by you as a worker, you might find it useful. You might find, for example, that you need to pick up a line and one of you is away from the mic, and so you deep fake a line so that you can pick it up because you made a mistake and you've realized you've libeled someone, and that living in Australia where you have the world's second stupidest libel laws after the UK, that you might end up losing everything you have. And so you say, no, Rupert Murdoch isn't an immortal blood-sucking vampire, he's an alleged immortal blood-sucking vampire, and thereby escape penury. And you just Jasmine deepfakes Maggie's voice saying that. Who cares, right? Like, that's fine, right? That's you driving adoption. But the idea that you have to, deepfake your voices and then use AI to write your scripts and then blah, 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 blah. I mean, AI has nothing to say, right? The reason AI art is so washed is that when we first saw it, we'd never really encountered, paintings that didn't have painters and, books that didn't have writers. And so we imputed, or you might say hallucinated, writers and painters that were directing the painting as opposed to just statistical inference that was producing the painting or producing the words. And so, we put the meaning in it, but it has no meaning, and it can't have meaning. If you're an atheist like me, you might think that a sunset is interesting or beautiful, but you don't think it's trying to tell you anything. But someone who takes a picture of a sunset and texts it to you, or someone who paints a painting of the sunset, part of the aesthetic experience of looking at that image is trying to understand what the person who made that image was feeling and wanted you to feel. And so we can get that from AI so long as we don't realize that AI has nothing to say. But as soon as we realize it has nothing to say, it just all turns into something that's very washed. It might be technically interesting or aesthetically striking, but it's not beautiful and it's not important, right? It can't be. If there was a spot somewhere in the world, my kid is going to a university in California called Santa Cruz, And there's this tourist trap nearby that's very famous called the Mystery Spot, where water seems to flow uphill. It's just an optical illusion, right?
Oh, yeah.
But if there was like a mystery spot where you went there and you threw a pile of leaves in the air and they fell down and made a sentence, we would flock to that mystery spot for quite some time and look and marvel at the sentences. But eventually we'd realize they're not very good sentences, and that the important thing about them is not their literary merit, but the strange technical underpinnings of this phenomenon. And, I think that AI is technically interesting. I just don't think that it's art. I don't think it can do your job. I think, most people's bosses are, credulous weirdos who are infinitely horny to replace workers with automation. And so that the fact that the AI can't do your job doesn't mean that it won't try, that your boss won't fire you and replace you with AI that can't do your job, because they're an easy mark for an AI salesman who's like, let's fire Maggie and split her wages between me and my boss, Sam Altman, right? But that doesn't mean the AI can do your job, and we should be, kind of careful materialists about this. We shouldn't help the AI salesman raise money by going out there and stipulating to facts not in evidence, like the idea that the AI can do your job.
Totally. And I think that's how we feel, like being anti-AI. It's like anti-AI of what it's doing to the culture and like the AI slop it's producing, and the way people are treating it like it's this new god. When we work in media here in Australia, and we've seen so many of our journalists and writer friends be made redundant. So it feels very real, or being told, you should use AI to output more and more and more, like we are becoming the robots essentially. So I think that's why we are so critical about it. But you wrote a great article for The Guardian titled "AI Companies Will Fail, We Can Salvage Something from the Wreckage." And in it, you pretty definitively say that AI is a bubble. Why do you think AI is a bubble?
Well, there's two parts to that. So the first is, why do we have tech bubbles? And the second one is, why is AI one of them? So tech bubbles are part of that paradox of market saturation, that while you're growing towards monopoly status, the capital markets love you, right? A share in a firm, I think people don't really understand this. The fundamentals of a share in a firm is that it's a claim on the future income in that firm. And a growing firm has more future income than a mature firm, because tomorrow it's going to make more than it made today, right? So if you have two firms, one of which made $1 million this year in profit, the other one made $1 million in profit, but the second one is going to make $2 million next year, then a share in that firm is worth more, right? Now, the corollary of this is that the instant you become mature, say because you've got a 90% search market share, your firm is grossly overvalued. And what we see are these flash sell-offs in tech firms when their growth slows down. And, I think leftists kind of have done the world a disservice by repeating this truism. Endless growth is the ideology of a tumor, right? As though the reason these companies want to keep growing, or the people who run them want their firms to keep growing, is purely ideological. It's not, it's material, right? If your net worth is in shares in the company you work for or founded, and a failure to continue to grow results in an 80% reduction in the value of those shares, the reason you want to keep the growth going is not ideological. It's because you don't want to be 80% poorer, and whomst amongst us wants to be 80% poorer. And so there needs to be a story about how you're going to keep growing, even when you've saturated your market. And, you can ground that story in real things. You can say, oh, we're doing the pivot to video. We're Facebook now, but tomorrow we're going to be Facebook plus YouTube, and we're going to absorb all of YouTube's revenues. Or you can say, oh, we're launching Google Plus, so we're Google today, but tomorrow we're going to be Google plus Facebook, and we're going to absorb all of Facebook's revenue. The problem with that is that, when you claim you're going to become Facebook, Facebook has other ideas and will go out and tell people why that's not true. And so you can claim instead that you're going to conquer a market that you've just pulled out of your ass, right? We're going to conquer the metaverse. We're going to conquer cryptocurrency or DAOs or NFTs or, Web3. And while those things don't exist, the advantage of a thing that doesn't exist is that no one knows how much it's worth. And since you just pulled that out of your ass, you're the world's leading authority on how much it's worth. And so you can claim it's worth umpty $trillion. And provided you have a new story by the time that old story is proved not to be real, you're like running across the river on the backs of alligators without losing a leg, right? Then you can just keep the growth story going. And so long as the growth story is going, you can grow by other means, right? Like if your shares are highly liquid because you have a high price to earnings ratio because you're growing, then you can buy another company with your shares. Buying other companies with shares is great, because shares are an endogenous substance produced within the four walls of the firms. You make them by typing zeros into a spreadsheet, right? Boring old money is something you have to get from like a bank or a customer or an investor. And if you try to make the money within the four walls of the firm, someone from the treasury shows up and takes you away in handcuffs, right? And so, that growth stock is like, it's worth a lot because it can also beget more growth. It can become a kind of self-licking ice cream cone. But when you stop growing, well, the reverse happens. You enter a nosedive. All the employees who are compensated in shares leave. You can't use them to restart the business. All the other companies you buy to restart your growth want money now, and you don't have any, right? So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so AI is the latest of these. So why is AI a bubble? Like, what makes me say AI is a bubble? Well, it's very large, and some of that size can be accounted for by the fact that there is a real computer science thing happening at the middle of AI in a way that exceeds the computer science value of, say, the incremental improvements in VR that were supposed to give us the metaverse, or the somewhat interesting trustless ledger maintenance that was supposed to give us blockchain futures or whatever. AI is real in the sense that like 10 years ago, some researchers took existing machine learning techniques, applied a minor variation, and instead of getting what you'd expect, which is like a minor improvement, they got a major improvement. And they're like, oh, look, we found some low-hanging fruit here. And then they checked, and there was like a low-hanging orchard, because you could just do the same minor variation harder and harder, and you get more and more major variants. Now, we've reached the end of that. Like, they're getting severely diminishing returns to scale. But, like, that is a real economic thing. When you get positive returns to scale, that is a real investment opportunity. But it's not this investment opportunity. When I wrote the book, AI Total Capital Expenditure had reached $700 billion US. That was just over a year ago. When the book hit shelves, the number being bandied about was 1.4 trillion, so that's doubling. But Gartner now says by the end of this year it's going to be 2.5 trillion. So $2.5 trillion in CapEx and OpEx, just the total burn rate of all these companies. Now, how much are they making? $50 billion a year, right? And 50 billion sounds like a lot until we're talking about 2.5 trillion. And although the assets themselves, they're not durable, right? So they're having to turn over the data centers and the GPUs like every couple of years. So it's not just that they have to replace the GPUs, they actually generally have to replace the data centers too, because the way that NVIDIA is actually getting more performance out of each generation of GPUs, which they need to do if they're going to convince people to buy new GPUs every year, is they're throwing away the design constraint that most firms operate under, which is backwards compatibility. And so each generation of GPU has very different power consumption, very different networking, very different heat dissipation, and retrofitting the data center, it basically means scraping it to the foundation slab and building a new data center there. And so you've got these data centers that you have to turn over every couple of years, GPUs you have to turn over every couple of years, you're only making $50 billion a year, you're spending trillions every year. The 7 companies that are 35% of the S&P 500, 6 of which are losing money to the 7th, which is NVIDIA. So when they run out of money, so does NVIDIA. They're passing around the same $100 billion IOU really fast and pretending that it's in everyone's bank account at once, which, my other life, I write science fiction novels, including a best-selling series about a forensic accountant who unwinds tech scams. And to call that an accounting trick is to do violence to the noble accounting trick. It's so stupid, right? And so, you look at all of that, and like Stein's law of finance is anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. You can't spend trillions of dollars every year on $50 billion of revenue forever. Eventually, it's going to stop.
Because a lot of the conversations that we hear about it is, AI is inevitable, that there's no alternative to it. Should we stop talking in this way? Is this how we start to kind of turn the conversation around? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that's the trick here. I mean, look, when the bubble goes away, we're still going to have lots of hardware. We're going to have lots of skilled technicians who don't have to answer to their stupid bosses anymore because they're out of a job. And we're going to have open source models that will have lots of room for optimization and improvement. And so whatever use you get out of AI is going to be around for you. You're going to be able to do it. What we're not going to have are these companies that are selling $100 bills for $1 a piece, losing thousands of dollars on every customer. And this inevitabilism, I think, is it's a very cheap rhetorical trick, and as are kind of the invidious comparisons that are made between AI and other technologies that ultimately panned out after losing money, like Amazon or the web. The web did lose money when it started, but the web had very good unit economics, which is a finance term for how firms perform at the margin, right? When they add a new customer, when the customer makes a new use, when you get a new generation of the technology, if you have good unit economics, then all of those are positive factors. And that was true of the web. Every web user made the web more profitable. Every time that web user returned to the web got more profitable again. Every generation of the web was more profitable. And that's not true of AI. AI loses money on every customer and loses more money on every customer's every use, and every generation of AI loses more money than the previous generation. And so the idea that it's inevitable is absurd. That there may be some kind of technology down the pipe that is going to make some money with this, but it's not going to look anything like these companies. And these companies, I don't think they have a path to survival after having committed all of this capital. We are really running up against sums that are proper business threatening sums, even for very large, very profitable businesses. Facebook's a good example here. Meta pissed away $61 billion on the metaverse. And that sounds like a lot, but over the last 3 years, they spent $150 billion. They spent another $150 billion this year on AI. And they're talking about more next year. And they've had to do thousands of redundancies because they've run out of money. And now they're saying, well, we can't keep the lights on because we don't have the programmers anymore, because we thought the AI could do their jobs. And it turns out it can't. But we don't have the money to hire back the programmers because we spent it all on AI.
100%. Do you think, where do you think this ends? Or how do you, and this is such a big question, I'm just so interested by your answer, but how do you think this bubble will burst, or when?
Yeah.
Could you predict when? Is it going to be the defining
so I think the
2030s?
2030s would be a very good long innings. I'd be very surprised if we were still talking about this in the 2030s. But I earlier mentioned Stein's law of finance, that anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. There's an equally important law, or rather aphorism, John Kenneth Galbraith, who said the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So I don't know when the bubble is going to burst. I think whenever the bubbles do burst, we look back and we say, well, in hindsight, it was obvious that it was about to go. And certainly, the AI finance bubble it has a lot of very brittle contingencies, right? So think about how much money on data centers is coming from Gulf sovereign wealth funds and individuals in the Gulf whose income is tied to the oil sector there, and whose pipelines and refineries and LNG terminals keep getting bombed by Iran, right? And maybe one of them pulls out of a key deal, and these deals are all structured so that if one bit of them fails, then there's a cascade of failures through a bunch of other deals because they're cross-collateralized, and they have very, very tight tolerances. It's a machine with a lot of tight couplings and without a lot of slack in the system. And so anything could knock it over. And that's why I think you see these panic sell-offs from time to time whenever there's a little bobble. I think that there's a difference between the investors who are all in on AI because they think AI is about to become God and do all the jobs and make infinite money hack, and then the investors who are I'm just in because those weirdos will buy AI at any price, and so I'm just going to buy AI and sell it to them. And when those people bail, because those people are sleeping with one eye open and one fist poised over the sell button, and when those people bail, it's going to be a bloodbath for everyone, because they're the ones who are making up the real money in this, the bulk. Now everyone is at this phase trying to unload on us, right? That this is the point in the in the bubble where you try to find exit liquidity in the form of everyday suckers, because that's what bubbles are, right? Even productive bubbles, even railroad bubbles or the web bubble or whatever, they're very evil. Like the point of a bubble is you have people who are just everyday savers who are putting away money that they can barely afford to not spend today because they're worried that when they get old they'll be homeless and that they'll starve. And you take those people who are desperate and scared and who no longer have defined benefit pensions and who have to have these market pension accounts where they know they're the sucker at the poker table. They know that they don't understand the market as well as the real market players and that they're in danger of losing everything. And you say, here's a sure bet. And you get them to pile in and they take the dodgy stock off your hands and then they're left holding the bag when it all pops. And we're seeing a real effort to bring in those suckers now. Elon Musk's IPO is the kind of exhibit A here, where we've all been told that if you want to be financially literate and you want to save money for the future, you should just buy stock indexes, these index funds where you own a little of all the shares, top shares in a important stock exchange like the NASDAQ or the S&P or the FTSE here in London. And he got these exemptions that allowed his company to debut in the indexes, because normally, even if a company is in the top 100 of the S&P or the Nasdaq, it doesn't get included until it's been listed for a few consecutive quarters of growth, because it might just be that there's a lot of exuberance around the initial flotation, and so you don't want to stick a bunch of pensioners or would-be pensioners with this garbage stock. And he got an exemption, right, allowing his shares to be listed immediately in the on the exchanges indexes, which means that every index fund manager is required to buy those shares, right? They can't say, well, I think this one's dodgy, right? If you run a NASDAQ 100 fund, you are legally obliged to have as many shares in that fund as are representative of their proportion in the top 100. So if SpaceX is 5% of the 100, then 5% of your shares in your fund have to be SpaceX at any price, And one of the things that Musk did was restrict the number of shares that they floated from the company so that insiders could sell their shares. And the insiders were also exempted from the normal lockout that prevents insiders from dumping their shares the day the flotation happens. And so we're left holding the bag, right? Everyone who just taken the advice that you've been given since high school, right, that you should be putting away a certain share of your wages every week, and that you should take that and buy index funds. We're left holding the bag for the Emiratis, for the tech billionaires, for Musk himself, as they unloaded this dog shit stock that today is trading significantly below the IPO price. It took less than a week for all those gains to disappear and for the stock to go negative.
It feels so hopeless, so much of the conversation. And as we head towards wrapping up our conversation, I think a big question that we have a lot at the back of our minds is, how do we continue to move forward when big tech is so entrenched in so many of our lives? And especially we're having these conversations predominantly on social media, predominantly on, platforms like Spotify. Is it hypocritical to critique while we still actively engage with them?
Yeah. So I think that this 40, 50 years of neoliberalism has really broken our brains about how change happens. We've been told that change is the result of personal consumption choices, that the way you get rid of a monopoly is to shop really carefully, and that's all a boycott is. A boycott is you agonizing over whether you should have a Twitter account or what to buy at the grocery shop. That's not a boycott, right? BDS or the South African anti-apartheid boycott or the Montgomery bus boycott where people didn't ride the bus for 380 consecutive days. That wasn't careful shopping, right? That wasn't 380 days of people waking up and going, well, I guess I'm walking to work, right? It was a movement. I know that going to meetings sucks and it's full of tedious people who quote Robert's Rules of Orders and no one can agree on who's going to do the washing up afterwards. But, actual change comes from organizing carpools when you're going to boycott the bus, and having crisply articulated goals, and going to the legislatures, and bringing people into an ideological project. You know, what happened after they broke the Montgomery bus segregation system is they had a civil rights movement made up of the people who came together as comrades by breaking the bus system. Right, that's the advantage of it. So you're not going to shop your way out of this stuff, and like worrying about your consumption choices is a mug's game, because the fact that you can't change things by shopping carefully is going to make you very demoralized, and it's going to make you angry at your friends, because you're going to go like, I have been agonizing in the grocery aisle for the last 10 years, and we still have, you know, cruel conditions in our hen farms. And it must be because you're not shopping carefully enough. And so now I'm angry at you because you're not a good shopper like me, right? So the way that you actually make change is you join a polity, right? You do politics. And so local politics suddenly becoming very salient, especially with the data center fights. Let me tell you, you know, your town fathers are not signing non-disclosure agreements and skipping the environmental review because they know you're going to be pleasantly surprised and they don't want to ruin it. Right? The only reason to do that shit is if they know you're going to hate it. Local politics in the age of rising fascism turns out to be the difference between whether you have flock cameras or not, which also turns out to be the difference between whether your neighbors are going to be kidnapped and sent to a gulag. And, you know, if you think that can happen in Australia, I've got a little offshore island full of people who are seeking asylum who have something else to tell you about the Australian attitude towards authoritarianism. Not to mention that weird Queensland governor whose wife baked the famous pumpkin pies, who banned all gatherings of more than 5 people. Right? I mean, there is authoritarianism lurking in the political capacity of every polity. So you got to get involved. Local politics is easier than you think, and can make a big difference. You can also get involved with unionization. That's very important. If you want labor-driven automation, then you need labor power. Tech workers especially need to be thinking about this, because like the reason you got the free kombucha and the massages and a surgeon who'd freeze your eggs so that you could work through your fertile years wasn't because your boss liked you. It was because they were scared of you quitting. And now that they've had mass layoffs, they're just not scared of that anymore. And we know how they treat the workers they're not scared of. They're the ones pissing in bottles or working in factories in iPhone City with suicide nets around them. And then finally, you get involved in the international struggle. And I, as I say, work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF.org. We have intervened many times and in many ways in Australian tech policy fights, and we continue to do so. I was their first European director and worked in 31 countries for them. And we have a very big international practice. And so going to EFF.org and also looking at in Australia groups like EFA, EFA, Electronic Frontiers Australia, is a very good way to get involved as well. And I get it, you know, it's not as much fun as shopping. The difference is it's going to make a difference. The only people who can vote with their wallets are billionaires, because their wallets are thicker than ours. And that's why they want you to try and vote with your wallet too.
That's so good. That's so good. Because I was about to say, well, we live in capitalism, so you do vote with your dollar, but you
vote with your ballot.
Disproved that already. Yeah.
And our last question is, what's something that makes you feel hopeful about the future?
Oh, well, being out with other people who hate fascism. So we had a big fascist march in London about a month ago, about 25,000 fascists marching through central London. And I joined the counter march where we had like 150,000 people marching against it. Yeah. So that was very hopeful.
Sadly, we don't have time to keep, going down this road, because I would really love to, I have so many more questions for you. But every week on our podcast, we give our listeners recommendations of what we've enjoyed reading, watching, or listening to recently. Can you please share a recommendation that you've been loving lately?
Oh, wow. A thing I've been loving lately. Yeah. So there is a weird trend going on amongst my colleagues, which is that my writerly colleagues, which is that they all seem to be writing magnum opuses. I'm writing like 3 short books a year. They're writing 1 giant book every 5 years. So like China Mayville just told me that he's got this 900-page novel that he's just finished, and that there's a advanced review copies going out for. And Molly Crabapple just wrote this 780-page history of the Jewish Bund, which was this alternative to Zionism that was anti-Zionist, founded the same year as Zionism, called Here Where We Stand is Our Country. That's stunning. She learned to speak Yiddish to write it. It's amazing. But the one that I want to talk about is Ada Palmer's Inventing the Renaissance. Palmer is a Renaissance historian and science fiction writer. She's famous at the University of Chicago for every year doing a 4-week-long LARP in which they reenact the election of the Medici's Pope. And everyone gets an actual character sheet that's like a 30-page character sheet with all of their motivations, all of their alliances and rivalries, and they're all real people from the election of the Medici's Pope. And at the end of it, they take over this fake Gothic cathedral at the University of Chicago, and they elect a pope. And every year it's different. And her point is that history is contingent, that we're not its prisoners, that we can change history. And Inventing the Renaissance is a historiography of the Renaissance. So it's the story of the histories of the Renaissance that we started writing during the Renaissance and that we've written and rewritten ever since. And it's about the political work and the ideological work and the aesthetic work that how we think about the Renaissance does and why it's changed so much over the years. It's a really sprightly, fun, novelistic kind of book, but it's incredibly important, and it will make you understand this current moment so differently when you read it. It's an incredible introduction to the Renaissance, to history, to historiography, to Palmer's work. Palmer's also like a librettist and a singer. She's written an entire opera about the Nordic mythos. She's just amazing. She's just a goddamn machine. And this book, Inventing the Renaissance, is stunning.
Oh my gosh, it sounds right up our alley. Like you're saying, like our buzzwords, like so excited. Yeah, thank you so much for those recommendations. We will link them in the show notes below.
And thank you so much for joining us today, Cory. We've so appreciated it. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. It really means a lot.
Well, thank you. It meant a lot to talk with you folks too. I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.